Well, for today, we're going to look at biological invaders, invasive alien species, as they're sometimes called. We're going to introduce the topic. We're going to look a little bit at invader biology, what makes a species invasive in particular. We're going to focus in on a case study of 4 different types of pests, and then we're going to consider some remediation challenges and future issues. Here we have the famous cane toad, something that is becoming quite infamous in Australia. An introduced pest that was brought there intentionally to control bugs on sugarcane. Unfortunately, it can't hop high enough to eat the bugs, but it is now making its way across the continent. There are lots of documentaries about that.
And a couple books.
So biological invasions. One of the things about this issue, which is one of the most important and leading causes of extinction today, probably second only to fragmentation and habitat destruction, is that it's doing the reverse of fragmentation, changing the principles of geographic distribution and separation or isolation. We basically reversed the process of geographic distribution limits. If you Google invasive species for Maine, here's a sampling for the eastern half of our continent. You might recognize some of them: the hemlock woolly adelgid on this eastern hemlock, purple loosestrife, and the emerald ash borer. What's that little thing there? Gypsy moth, and you may recognize others. For the western side of our continent, in Oregon, invasive pigs, and this little mussel we'll look at later. To quote Andrew Nikofric, famous Albertan journalist and author of the book Pandemonium, biological invaders are the equivalent of break-and-enter gangs threatening to rearrange every household of nature with one frightful explosion after another. And he's using the language of Charles Elton, the famous invader biologist who started writing and thinking about invasive species in the last century. This idea of explosions. If we look at invader effects, we can see that in North America, there's about 34 non-native mammals, 60 bird species or more. Islands are particularly vulnerable for reasons you will understand. Their prior isolation and ecological naivety, combined with small population size and limits to distributions, means that hardy species from continents or mainlands tend to do quite well against the native biota. Common invaders, you've got mosquito or insects, goats, cats, dogs, rats, pigs, mice, and when it comes to plants, perennial weedy herbs and shrubs. Don't forget the Godzilla fish. You can look it up. Here's our cane toad and this dangerous rabbit invading Australian ecosystems. Do you recognize this guy? A longhorn beetle. There was lots of talk of that invader a few decades ago when it first invaded the North American continent and decimated trees. Biodiversity impacts are significant. The percent that are threatened of the terrestrial vertebrate species in North America amounts to about 3.4%. In places like Australia, that island continent, 64% are threatened by invasive species of its mammals. It's quite an astounding proportion of vertebrate biota that is endangered. And they're arriving, of course, due to human hands. This is happening intentionally, as in the case of sparrows and starlings, which were introduced on purpose, species such as holly that were introduced into Western North America. But it also includes unintentional introductions. So every 24 hours, we have thousands of species moved around in ballast on ships, essentially reversing years of geographic separation. Here are just a few of the species invading the Great Lakes, including the sea lamprey that attaches to organisms. So according to invasion specialist Anthony Ricciardi at McGill University, the current reshuffling of the Earth's biota is a massive invasion event without precedent in the planet's history. Sure, organisms have moved around and even broken geographic barriers. We talked about that when we talked about long-distance dispersal. But the rate at which this is happening is completely unprecedented. Hulme documents some of the pathways of movement for invasive species and how that's changed over human history. And according to Hulme, 3 recent jumps in invasion rates have happened since the advent of agriculture. One happened at the end of the Middle Ages, another at the end of the Industrial Revolution in 1850, probably around the time when international trade was beginning to take off to fuel some of the sorts of activities that industrial nations were engaged in. And it involved quite a bit of travel and transport worldwide in order to access goods and provide them to Britain or Europe or North America. But the last few decades, this era of globalization, is a major step in that change. According to Hull, the world has entered a new phase in the magnitude and diversity of biological invasions. And the rate is accelerating. There's an increasing rate of trade and travel all the time. The COVID pandemic momentarily interrupted that. In the 1980s, global trade outpaced all previous trade since the beginning of civilization. And the value of food trade alone, for example, has grown by 200% in the last 20 years, from 100 billion to 300 billion. And that's according to Nick Ofrick in his book Pandemonium. He goes on to talk about the comparison to 18th century, in which only a handful of sailing ships could transport more than several hundred tons of cargo. That increased in the 1960s to thousands of tons, and today 5,000 times 20-ton containers full of various goods that we require for our modern lifestyles. Over the past 200 years, the average distance traveled and the speed of travel have increased 1,000 times. So that gives you a sense of the kind of problem that we're dealing with when it comes to the risk of unintentionally introducing species. And there's an economic cost to this. It's in the order of 1.4 trillion, and that's a global cost, a cost to the entire economy. In the news just this week, damage from invasive species trebling every decade and intensifying amidst the shortfall of funds and action, according to the researchers, who say that the rapidly growing costs show no sign of slowing down and are more than 10 times higher than the funding for preventing or dealing with invasions. Here's the article that is based on. You're welcome to read the abstract if you wish. So this brings back some of the early calls to regulate and deal with invasions. Remember Daniel Simberloff, and he's another major invasion biologist. He cites the precautionary principle and says we need to pay attention to this idea that local environment protection should trump all other considerations. What that means is that you don't want to intentionally introduce another cultivar into a region or a pest controlling pest into a region like the cane toad unless you've absolutely considered very carefully. Now, one of the things about invasion biology is it can be difficult to predict. And it's worth mentioning that in spite of the hundreds and hundreds of species that are moved about and introduced into new systems all the time, only a very small fraction of them ever becomes invasive. But it's difficult to predict who is going to be that species. And part of the reason for that is based on looking at the history of invaders. According to this article, Crooks 2005, there tend to be these long lags in which introduced species might just stick around not doing too much for a long time. And then they might suddenly come into their own. Sometimes species respond to slight changes in environment, but they also evolve. So here's the trajectory of the number of exotics in different regions, including the Great Lakes, United Kingdom, and the Baltic. But if we could come up with some traits that spell success, I suppose that would help us to predict invasion likelihood. What are the characteristics? Maybe you can jot them down and think about them. Here's a little hint. Zebra mussels, females can lay between 30,000 to 1 million eggs each year. So zebra mussels, one of the most infamous species in Canada to become an invader. And if I had to name some traits, I'd say it's weedy. It has high reproductive rates. It probably has good dispersal mechanisms. It's probably fairly generalist. It can tolerate different kinds of habitat and food, and it can shift between those as environment dictates. And being disturbance adapted seems to be correlated with invader biology. That said, decades of research on invasive species doesn't provide fail-safe or foolproof traits that you can use to predict invasion. There are a lot of unpredictables, including dietary switches. Another factor about invasive species, which is important to mention, is that they escape controls on their populations when they're moved to new places. Often, they're not moved alongside with every pathogen, parasite, or predator that they were accustomed to. And so, in some ways, they have an advantage relative to native species, which are dealing with a whole host of co-evolved predators and pathogens that are regulating their populations. The invader has a bit of a step up by escaping those. And then there may be interactions with climate change. So let's look at zebra mussels. They're native to the Black and Caspian Seas all the way over here. They managed to move right the way around the world, first discovered in Lake St. Clair in the Great Lakes region by a researcher from the University of Windsor. And that's a zebra mussel right there. Doesn't look too dangerous. How did it get there? It moved around in ballast water. Ships that were traveling up the St. Lawrence Seaway were moving tons of cargo. And the way they do that is that at their source port, so let's say in the Black Sea, they load in a bunch of ballast water. And then they head over to their destination with their ballast tanks full, containing any organisms and propagules that went into that ballast water. Their holds are empty because they're waiting to stock up in the next port. Maybe they arrived down the St. Lawrence Seaway all the way in Lake Ontario or Lake Erie, where they discharge their ballast water, load up their cargo, and head off. Well, now the Great Lakes has some ballast water from the Black Sea. Zebra mussel cause big troubles. It clogs power plant intakes, coats pipes. It hitches rides to inland lakes on recreational boats and spreads like wildfire. In fact, within months of discovery, there were billions in the Great Lakes Basin. In short, it attaches to pretty much everything, including a shopping cart that somebody threw into the lake. Being able to scrape those mussels off the surfaces of pipes is an expensive ordeal. Here's a picture of its life cycle, which includes a planktonic or larval stage in which there are 10,000 per meters cubed per day, although there's a high mortality rate. Once they grow, they filter feed about 1 liter of water each day. They get bigger, and then they lay lots and lots of eggs, which restarts that whole cycle. Needless to say, there have been many ecosystem impacts. Here's a unionid. It's a clam from one of the Great Lakes, and mussels have stifled and attached to it, so its chances of survival are nil. It changes the community composition by filter feeding and cleaning out the water column, essentially. It filter feeds on phytoplankton, and it depletes the water column, which makes it hard for native bivalves to feed. It also does some weird things that actually has an effect of shifting carbon and nutrients from the pelagic, that is the water column, to the benthic zone, where it deposits organic matter in the form of its excrement. So that changes the ecosystem quite a bit. It's worth mentioning that in Lake Michigan at least, the zebra mussel is declining. From 1994 until 2010, it appears to be peaking and then disappearing, while its relative, the quagga mussel, another dry cynid species, has begun to take over. It's also a filter feeder, so an interesting pathway for this population. Nevertheless, the zebra mussel is making its way into other waterways in North America, so stay tuned. Arriving near you. So that's the zebra mussel. Lots of fun. And here's the story of another invader. This is the brown tree snake, Boiga irregularis, and it is in the island of Guam in the South Pacific. Native to Australia and New Guinea, it probably arrived in Guam from an island off New Guinea, imported in cargo. So it was accidental or unintentional. Preys on native lizards and birds, and it causes power outages by climbing onto electrical wires. Here's a whole bunch of specimens for study. The interesting thing about the brown tree snake is that it illustrates a lot of the aspects of invader biology. Let's kind of think about them. Arrival, it's good at dispersal, and it's good at doing that with human vectors. In fact, it was a stowaway on military cargo planes. It's a generalist. While it tends to nest in trees, it'll go for caves. And while it likes to eat birds, it'll also eat frogs, lizards, and small mammals. And it'll have an occasional egg or a hamburger. And its impacts on invaded systems, well, it's gotten rid of 9 of 12 forest bird species, half the lizards, some bat species, and a little bit of the poultry industry, having economic impacts on food supply. Control is expensive, and it's important to say in all invasive species, eradication is rarely possible. Nevertheless, in order just to keep this thing at bay, about 75 million over the 5 years from 2004 was used to control its presence. Our third portrait. Here's another invader. Again, how similar is it to an organism like us, a large vertebrate? Some would say we are an invader, but we're rather unusual, apart from perhaps things like dogs. So this is actually a fungus. It's called white nose disease, and it is a very sad tale of our native brown bat, which has succumbed to this pathogen imported again unintentionally. And because bats are social creatures, this fungus has spread far and wide. And the way it infects bats is really, really sad. As they roost or nest during the winter, it affects their ability to settle. So it keeps waking them up. When they should be sleeping and they can't get food, it interferes with their metabolic ability to conserve energy. The bats simply die. A researcher, Dr. Oettingen, his statement is quite poignant. He watched a live bat nuzzling a group of dead ones. Again, these are social creatures. Here's a cave affected by white nose disease. It's called Guano Hall, and you can see that from 2009 until 2011, the bat population has been decimated. A photograph from Colbert. So microorganisms are becoming really significant. Don't forget the microbes we talked about that resulted in the functional extinction of the native chestnut. Nicophorus says the blight didn't have much of a career in Asia, where local trees had developed defenses against it. But when the voracious fungus was introduced to New York forests in 1802, in just 50 years it spread over 91 million hectares and killed a quarter of the shade trees in eastern North America. 10 moth species that lived on the chestnut tree became extinct, and a good part of North America died forever. The quote is important because it indicates a bunch of different things about invaders. The fact that they don't do too well in their native land, but that they have this significant advantage in introduced locations. Second, that when one species goes extinct, it may take others down with it, those 10 moth species. There are remediation challenges, and the example of those foundation species in eastern forests is a good one. Ellison et al. Talks about restoring eastern hemlock by, for example, using annual chemical injections of individuals for hemlock adelgid. That is simply not feasible at stand or regional scales. So some of the solutions that we have are just too expensive and cannot be sustained realistically. His suggestion is to set aside large areas or reserves and adopt an integrated ecosystem approach, that is, looking at the whole system. But it's probably not that simple. And recent dialogue or discussion about invasive species has increasingly focused on the potential that we may just have to live with them and hope that ecosystems adjust or view them in a different way in order to perhaps manage specific ones, but not all. It's this idea that's related to the emergence of novel or non-analog ecosystems in the Anthropocene. We'll touch on that a little bit later in term. But the result, for now, is biotic homogenization, the McDonaldization of nature, according to Nicophorus, in which exotic species introduced promise a future of simplified species-poor ecosystems, loaded with small, fast-reproducing species, and humans. And to quote Charles Elton, the scientist I mentioned earlier, if we look far enough ahead, the eventual state of the biological world will become not more complex, but simpler and poorer. And he said that in 1958, before anyone was really paying attention. And then there's this. Climate change is on the horizon, and it is having an impact on the spread of invasive species and the relationship between native species and invasive species. Remember that species have to migrate to cope with climate change, and that invasive species are often, by definition, good at dispersing. There may be a little bit of a leg up for invasive species to the detriment of native species by comparison.